Well, Book TV on C-SPAN 2 is on location at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. We are in the Annenberg School of Communication currently, and joining us is the Dean of the Annenberg School, Michael X. Delli Carpini. Dean Delli Carpini, what is the Annenberg School of Communication?
Well, we're a freestanding school, one of 12 here at Penn, and we do research, both research for the public consumption and for scholarly work, and PhD training and undergraduate training on the way in which media and communication influence social practices, political practices, health practices, and cultural practices.
Well, we're here specifically to talk to you about your most recent book, After Broadcast News, Media Regimes, Democracy, and the New Information Environment. But it seems that for the last 20 to 30 years, we've been debating the after broadcast news scenario. How do you assess it?
Well, what we're trying to do in this book is put it into a little bit of historical context. So our basic argument is that over the last 20 years, there have been a number of changes, some of them slow, some of them more quick, that are changing the way in which we think about where we get public affairs information from. And the three big changes that we think are going on are the blurring of news and entertainment, so think The Daily Show, although it's more than that. The blurring of producers and consumers, there think about the impact that the Twitter and that YouTube had in the Iranian or the Middle Eastern Arab Spring revolutions, but also in American elections. And the third is the blurring of fact and opinion. We lived in an era prior to this where we thought there was a clear line between when journalists were presenting us factual information from a neutral or fair perspective and when we were hearing opinions. That has broken down. And those three changes, we think, have been driven by a variety of things, not the least of which is the technological revolution that we've undergone over the last 20 years.
Professor, have we lost important gatekeepers of news in your view?
I think that is one of the central themes of the book, which is that we now live in a world that we call, somewhat nerdily, multi-axiality. And what we mean by that term is really pretty simple, which is the ways in which information can become public information and paid attention to by a lot of people is much more fluid. There are many more gates than there used to be. You could argue that you don't even need gates because the walls have come down. And so where we get information from, what becomes newsworthy or important, what goes viral, is very, very different from what used to be the case in the period just prior to this era. But the other larger point we're trying to make is that we can't just compare what we have now to what preceded it, the 50 years of broadcast news. That if you look more historically, we've actually had 4 or 5 different media regimes, as we call them, in which the relationship between the media, citizens, and political elites have been different. And so if we want to assess what's good or bad about the current environment, we need to look not just as what we've lost or gained compared to broadcast news, but what we've lost or gained compared to the era of realism in the 19th century, or the partisan press of the early 19th and late 18th century, or the progressive era. So we've really gone through these changes before, and the issue in front of us is not, is it good or is it bad, but what's good about it, what's bad about it, and how do we maintain what's good about it and try to limit what's bad about it.
Well, let's go to the title of your book, After Broadcast News. Let's go to the historical sense. What have we lost in this new era as opposed to the ABC, NBC, right. CBS right. era?
Yeah, and I think we've
which
lost
was an era.
And I think we've lost some significant things. And I should say lost, you made the point that we've been talking about this for 20 years. I mean, we're still transitioning, and so those stations, those news networks still exist. But when we lived in an era, which we did in the 50s and 60s, and did to some extent all the way up till the 90s, where we as a society, we as citizens, believed that if we watched the local news and then the national news, an hour or so period in the early evening, that we would have the information we need basically to be good citizens. And what we've lost by not having that is the authority that comes with gatekeepers, somebody whose job it is to sift through all the information that happens, in all the things that happen in a day, in a 24-hour period, and say, okay, we're professionals, we've thought about this, we have journalists, we are going to tell you from all this information what we think you should be paying attention to. So we lose that, and that's a nice thing to have. And we lose the fact that, for the most part, at the height of the broadcast era, the vast majority of the American public was thinking about the same set of issues. We were a community. You know, for better or worse, we were all thinking about the issues that those 3 stations and a few major newspapers and magazines were telling us were the things we should focus on. And that allows for some focus and an agenda. That allows for us as a community of citizens to think about issues in a kind of, and all have the same basic underlying understanding of them.
Michael X. Delli Carpini, what have we gained in this new era?
Well, what we gained is let me start by saying the downside to the system that I just described, which is if that handful of journalists and editors and producers and stations got it wrong, if they didn't emphasize something that is arguably important to a lot of people, or they got their facts wrong, or they were presenting something, even as they attempted to be neutral and objective, in a way that was biased, we all got that. So we sunk or swim with 3 networks and a handful of other major news outlets. In this environment, everybody is watching everybody else, if you want to think of it that way. That there is no single authoritative source, so we lose that sense of we're all in agreement, but that also means that there's real opportunities for voices that in the past would not have been heard, for topics that in the past would not have made it onto the national agenda, to actually make it onto the agenda and to become important because someone other than that handful of professional journalists told us it was important.
So, Dean, do you feel that we are better informed today than we were 20, 30, 40, 50
Well, that's a really
years
interesting
ago?
question. I would say that we are still in a transitional period, and the potential for being more informed is greater now than it used to be. But in all honesty, there's no evidence that we are better informed. I also do work in the area of what people know about politics, and the current evidence suggests that at best we're about as informed as we were in the broadcast era, and at worst we may be in a situation, and this is one of the downsides of the new information environment, where people who care about politics are better informed because there's so many places to go, but there are equally as many places to opt out of politics entirely now. And so people who don't care about politics, who want to simply watch entertainment purely in their 6 to 7 o'clock time frame, if they're still watching television in the normal way that we used to watch it, that those people can opt out of politics entirely. So the positive potential is we can be more informed about more things than we ever were. The downside, and we don't take a stance on this, we're arguing that both these are possible. The downside is that we can have a population of very informed people and people who are completely opt out of politics entirely.
When you look at the current information revolution that we're all living through right now, is there a comparable period in history?
Not that's completely comparable, and that's an important point that we make in the book, is that while we're comparing to the past, we think it's really important to realize there are things that are different. There has never been an opportunity for average citizens to be producers of information like we have today. And there's never been an opportunity for people to go to multiple sources globally than it is today. And for the agenda to be a national and even a global agenda without the news media being responsible for it. But we have certainly had periods of partisan press. So we think about Fox News and MSNBC, the fact that they seem more enamored of their ideological views than the facts that underlie them. We have gone through a period very much like that, where newspapers and other broadsheets were specifically allied with one party or another, said so right up front, and actually argued for or against particular points of view. We've had the equivalent of a Matt Drudge, the online gossip columnist, if you will, of politics, In the 18th century, there was a man named Matt Collender who did exactly the same thing in newspapers. So we've had that experience. We've had experience where the lines between